This is what happens when the Quran is arrogantly thrown into the sea. An arrogant captain forbids prayer, forbids reading the Quran, as if challenging the creator of the vast ocean. But the sea is not his. The sea belongs to Allah, and that wrath descends fiercely. This is the reward for those who challenge Allah. In the middle of the silvery blue Pacific Ocean, a giant cruise ship named the Saffron Glory sails gracefully through the waves. The sun's shimmer reflects off the ship like a giant mirror, dazzling the eyes of those who gaze at it from afar. This ship is no ordinary ship. It is a symbol of luxury, power, and freedom from a world full of limitations. Inside, the world feels disconnected from reality. A heated swimming pool sits on the top deck. Complete with a cocktail bar in the middle, guests stroll in designer casual wear, clutching glasses of red and white wine. On the other side is a luxurious restaurant with white-coated waiters bowing low to serve the finest seafood prepared by Michelin-starred chefs. 24-hour karaoke and a neon blue night bar brightly play pop, jazz, and classical music at the passenger's request. An artificial garden was built on the middle floor, complete with exotic flowers, dancing fountains, and even genetically engineered butterflies that never left the area. The Saffron Glory was a small world created for one purpose: to provide maximum pleasure without limits, without the distraction of morality, and without a place for worship. Yes, one thing was deliberately omitted from the map of this luxurious ship: the house of God. There were no temples, no places that could be considered sacred other than the ballroom, spa, and casino. Absolute freedom of religion was a principle upheld by the most powerful man on the ship, Captain Frederick Nolan. Captain Nolan stood on the steering bridge. His hand touched the large glass that stretched from floor to ceiling. From there, he could see the vast, boundless ocean, free as he was. His body was strong, his hair had turned partly white, but still neatly arranged. A clean, white captain's uniform covered his body, which had once been a naval soldier. Now he was no longer a warrior for his country, but a world-class commercial sailor who sailed the most luxurious ship owned by a European conglomerate. But what Captain Nolan is best known for is not his courage while leading the fleet in the Atlantic, but his cold and cynical attitude towards religion, especially Islam. Religion, he once said in an interview, is an addiction. It weakens reason, kills logic, and fools humanity, especially religions that believe in jinn and heaven. Medieval nonsense. For Nolan, there is no room for faith in modern life. He believes in one thing: human power, technology, science, and strategic precision are the keys to conquering the world, and he has done it. He can steer a ship the size of the Saffron Glory with one hand. Every button, every radar, and every coordinate is at his command. He feels like a god at sea. In a small meeting room, Nolan sits with the ship's officers. "I heard a crew member complain about the lack of a prayer room on this ship," he said in a low but sharp voice. His eyes sweep over everyone seated at the long oval table. One of the security managers, a bald man with a nervous face, nodded. "Yes, Captain." A janitor, Ridwan, a young man from Indonesia, asked permission to use one of the empty spaces on the lower deck for prayer. Captain Nolan frowned, then smiled sarcastically. Prayer? He raised an eyebrow. There was no place on this ship for ancient rituals. If he wanted to bow and kiss the floor, tell him to do it in the engine room, so the floor would be clean at the same time. The crew laughed nervously. No one dared to argue. Captain Nolan was not just a leader, but a symbol of the values the ship espoused: logic, control, and limitless entertainment. But what Nolan didn't realize was that not everything could be controlled. Not the human heart, not even destiny. The ship, though large and sophisticated, was but a drop in the ocean of God's creation. Even the most sophisticated engines could fail. Digital navigation could error. Satellite signals could be lost. But the human heart, when connected to the Almighty, could remain calm even when a storm arose. Elsewhere, far from the luxurious deck, Ridwan, the young man mentioned earlier, was mopping the floor of the long hallway leading to the galley. His shirt was soaked with sweat, but his face remained calm. In his pocket was a small, green-covered Quran. He knew reading the Quran would help him survive the ship's atmosphere, which was far from religious values. Ridwan never disobeyed orders, but he also never abandoned his faith. At night, when the ship was silent and the music began to fade, he sought a hidden corner, usually in the engine room or behind the warehouse, to pray. Sometimes he had to cover the floor with a rag to keep it clean, but for him, it was a sacred place he dedicated to his God. He had seen the captain pass by, staring into the distance. "Oh God, keep me in faith even in this place of darkness." Back on the steering bridge, Nolan gazed at the stars in the night sky. The sea breeze buffeted the large windows in front of him. The night felt calm, too calm. He sipped his black coffee and said quietly, almost to himself, "Who needs God in this time of progress?" He had no idea that the answer to that question would soon come. Not from books, not from debates, but from the angry ocean and the prayers of a simple young man. And so the glory's journey had just begun. Not just a physical journey, but a journey toward the truth it had long denied. Amidst the glittering luxury of the saffron glory, not many noticed the presence of a young man whose footsteps were barely audible. Yet his every movement brought a light to himself. His name was Ridwan, an Indonesian janitor. He had a slender body, tan skin, and a face that held a rare serenity in a place like this. Ridwan was not an important figure on the ship. He did not wear a jacket or tie, never appeared in fancy restaurants, let alone bars or karaoke. His job was one: cleaning up the remains of other people's parties, cleaning the floors of spilled wine, washing large mirrors covered in fingerprints, mopping the hotel corridors of expensive shoe prints. But behind this despised profession hid something noble: faith. Ridwan lived his days quietly. He never complained despite the heavy work and long hours. While his colleagues slept or indulged in the ship's entertainment, he often kept to himself. In his pocket was always a small, dark green-covered Quran, worn at the edges. It had been a gift from his mother before he left for work abroad. "Make this your friend, son," his mother said, holding Ridwan's hand. "If everyone else leaves, this Quran will still be here for you." And indeed, on that ship, Ridwan had almost no real friends. Most of the crew were too busy with worldly affairs. They laughed, joked, played cards, or even indulged in small parties when unsupervised. Some were kind, but none dared get too close to him. Religion, especially Islam, was a dirty word on the ship, taboo and considered disturbing the atmosphere. However, Ridwan did not change. He continued to pray his Laktu prayer, even though he had to find a suitable place. On a ship that size, there was not a single room provided for prayer, not one. So Ridwan usually prayed in a corner of the hot, buzzing engine room. Sometimes in the narrow hallway between two metal doors. He carried a small, neatly folded prayer mat and used it as a floor mat if the floor was too dirty. He took his ablution water from the workers' bathroom or, if necessary, from the refrigerator tap. That night, when the clock struck 23:17 and almost all the ship's guests were immersed in music and drinks, Ridwan sat cross-legged in the storage room near the engine room. The lights were dim, the engine humming softly. He opened his small mushaf and began to read this Quran. There was no doubt in him a guidance for those who fear Allah. He repeated the verse several times as if he were carving it into his own heart in a world full of lies. The verse was a shield for those who remember it, those who often recite it when they miss their mothers. And we have sent down something that is a cure and a mercy for the believers. Quran Surah 82. "O Allah," he whispered softly, "this Quran is a cure for my longing, for my loneliness, for my worries. Thank you for still watching over me in a place like this." His eyes were teary. He remembered his mother in the village who must be praying for him. He remembered the sound of the call to prayer from the mosque near his house. He remembered the cold but peaceful floor of the prayer room. All of that felt far away now, but not completely gone. Because as long as he continued to recite the words of Allah, they remained alive in his heart. One day, Ridwan was cleaning the lobby floor when a passenger dropped a drink glass. Ridwan swiftly mopped the wet floor. The passenger politely thanked him, but from a distance, Captain Nolan watched with a disapproving expression. The captain's voice echoed, Everyone turned. Ridwan straightened. "Yes, Captain. I hear you like to read the holy book during work hours." His tone was sarcastic. "I only read in my spare time." "Sir," Ridwan replied politely, "do you think reading that book will make this ship's engine run faster? Or do you hope those verses can stop the storm?" Ridwan lowered his head, but his heart was undaunted. He answered in a calm but firm voice, "That's not what I mean, Captain. The Quran is not a mechanical device, it is a guide. It is light, and it is a reminder that in this world there is a power greater than humans." The captain chuckled sarcastically. "That kind of belief is what keeps this world behind. Science and technology are what keep this ship standing, not a holy book that is thousands of years old." Ridwan didn't answer, but his heart said, "You just don't know it yet." From then on, Captain Nolan watched Ridwan more often, not out of admiration, but out of wariness. He saw Ridwan as a small threat who could spread spiritual ignorance on a ship built on logic and freedom without God. But Ridwan remained calm. Night after night, he continued to read the Quran, praying silently. He did not respond to hatred with anger. He did not resist, only endured, like a gentle but strong water. Ridwan was a small wave of faith that could not be drowned, because he knew that if his heart was connected to the sky, then no ocean could drown his soul. And in the midst of this vast ocean, the word from heaven continued to echo in his chest. On a ship that had no spiritual direction, Ridwan knew where he was going. He did not need a digital map or radar because he had a higher guidance, the Quran. That day, the sun illuminated the sea with dazzling rays. The sky was clear and cloudless. The saffron glory looked majestic like a floating palace on the blue carpet of the Pacific Ocean. Passengers seemed relaxed on the upper deck, reclining in lounge chairs, enjoying a glass of refreshing drink while listening to soft jazz music flowing from speakers hidden in the corner of the artificial garden. But behind the peaceful atmosphere, there was an ember starting to burn. Not in the sky, not in the ocean, but in the heart of a human being. Captain Frederick Nolan, dressed in his proud white uniform, stood on the bridge balcony. His eyes were fixed intently on the corridor below. He had just received a report that Ridwan, the janitor who had been distracting him several times, had been seen reading his holy book in the hold. Although he wasn't disturbing anyone, Ridwan's presence with the small mushaf seemed to challenge the principle he had upheld on his ship. The principle that religion was a fantasy. "That's enough," he muttered. He adjusted the captain's hat on his head, then walked quickly to the lower corridor where Ridwan usually served. Meanwhile, in the corner of the spare room near the engine room, Ridwan was sitting cross-legged. The recitation of the Quran came from his lips in a low but beautiful voice. He was reading the Ar-Rahman chapter, the verses of God's love for all his creatures. "So which of your Lord's blessings will you deny?" The verse felt like it pierced Ridwan's heart. In a place as harsh as this, God's blessings continued to flow. He was still alive, still able to read the holy book, and his heart was not dead. In that silence, he felt a peace that could not be bought with all the wealth of this ship. But that peace was immediately shattered when the door to the room opened loudly. "You again?" Nolan's voice echoed, sharp and cold. Ridwan stood quickly. He knew this was no ordinary meeting. The captain's eyes were filled with anger, and his footsteps shook the metal floor. "You think you're in a mosque?" "Huh," Nolan shouted. "How many times do I have to tell you there's no place for that ancient book on this ship?" Ridwan bowed respectfully and then said calmly, "I'm not bothering anyone, Captain. I just read the Quran in my free time to remember God and protect myself from evil." "Enough," Nolan interrupted. "Your book can't control storms. It can't move this ship. And it's nothing more than a novel written by a 19th century Arab." That sentence felt like a stab to Ridwan's heart, but he didn't retaliate with anger. His eyes stared calmly at Nolan. "Captain, slow down. The Quran is the word of Allah, the miracle of the Prophet Muhammad. Don't insult something you don't understand. It's not just a book, it's a light, a healer, and a guide." Captain Nolan clenched his fists, a burning sensation burning in his head. He took 2 steps forward and snatched the small Quran from Ridwan's hands. "Then let's see how sacred this book is," he said sarcastically. Before Ridwan could react, Captain Nolan slammed the mushaf to the floor. "Look at his shout," his voice echoing down the hall. "The holy book, it can fall, it can be damaged, just like your beliefs." Ridwan was shocked. His eyes widened. Not because he was afraid, but because his heart felt crushed. The Quran was more than just a book to him. It was a lamp, his mother's legacy, and his way of life. Slowly, Ridwan bent down and picked up the Quran from the floor. He held it tightly to his chest. "Sir, you may insult me, hit me, fire me," Ridwan said, but his eyes began to well up with tears. "But don't insult my Quran. I'm ready to lose everything, just not this." Several crew members who happened to be passing by in the hallway stared from a distance, transfixed. No one dared to approach. They witnessed two worlds colliding, one world filled with the arrogance of logic and the other one sustained by faith. Captain Nolan was silent. His breath was ragged. He hadn't expected Ridwan to remain standing after the insult. He had expected the young man to apologize or run away in fear. But no, what he saw was a figure far stronger than himself. Even though in terms of position and power, Ridwan meant nothing, in his heart, Nen felt insulted, as if he had been slapped by a belief he couldn't shake. Without another word, Nolan turned and left. Her voice echoed in the hall, filled with unfinished emotion. Ridwan stood still. His eyes were fixed on the small Quran in his hand, now slightly torn at the edges. But he didn't cry. Instead, he smiled faintly, because that day he knew he had defended something far greater than his job, his faith. After that incident, the pressure on Ridwan intensified. Captain Nolan established an unwritten rule. Anyone caught reading the holy book while working would be punished. Some staff began to avoid Ridwan, fearing repercussions. Even the engine room supervisor warned Ridwan not to cause trouble. But Ridwan didn't give up. He only grew quieter. He began keeping his Quran in an inner pocket of his shirt. He only read when completely alone, and the condition was now that he did it more quickly and more secretly. But his heart didn't give up. "Oh God," he whispered one night, "you see what happens to me? I just want to be close to M, even though the world is turning away from me. I'm sure you're with me." That night, the wind began to blow harder than usual, and on the magnificent ship that had no place for God, the sky began to hint that something was approaching. It wasn't just a storm at sea, but a storm that would shake the faith and arrogance of those who thought they could live without it. Days aboard the Saffron Glory were no longer the same for Ridwan. Since the Quran-throwing incident, everything had changed. The ship, once cold and unfamiliar, had now become a testing ground. No longer a place of work, but a place of silent survival and faith. Ridwan's steps felt heavy, not because of the slippery floor or the tiring task, but because of the stairs. Stairs filled with suspicion, cynicism, or fear. No longer did his colleagues greet him with a smile. Everyone stayed away as if Ridwan's presence brought bad luck. Every time he sat in a corner to read a verse or two of the Quran, someone would report him, either to his superiors or directly to Captain Nolan. Several times he was called and shouted at for no apparent reason. On one occasion, he was even kicked by one of the crew chiefs in the engine room, saying, "This is no place for a religious fanatic like you. Go hide in the hell of your book." Ridwan remained silent. He didn't reply, didn't glare angrily. He simply clutched his small copy of the Quran tighter. The wounds on his body were indeed painful, but the wound in his heart, seeing his God's words so mercilessly insulted, was far more torturous. But what was most heartbreaking for Ridwan was not the abuse itself, but the fear of those who witnessed it. He knew that many of the crew actually disapproved of his treatment. There was the kitchen maid who had once offered him warm tea. There was the laundry attendant who had once secretly given him time to pray. Even some of the passengers had greeted him kindly, but now they had all turned away, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid. Afraid of Captain Nolan's wrath. The captain had now become like a king on the ship he considered his kingdom. All had to submit to his will, and Ridwan, because of his courage in defending the Quran, was considered an unforgivable spiritual rebel. One night, Ridwan prayed under the emergency stairs leading to the rear deck. The place was narrow, quiet, and almost no one passed by. He spread out a small prayer mat and prostrated himself on the cold metal plate. Tears fell with each prostration. He felt so alone. But in that solitude, he felt an extraordinary closeness to his God. Finished, he opened his mushaf. That night he read, "Indeed, those who say our God is Allah, and then they remain, angels will descend upon them. Do not be afraid and do not grieve." Surah 30 is like looking at the night sky. I am not alone. "O Allah," it whispered, "they may hate me, but not you." But that night, unbeknownst to Ridwan, someone was watching from behind Captain Nolan's wall. Several hours later, Ridwan was summoned to the bridge. "Sit," Nolan ordered in a flat voice, without looking at him. Ridwan sat down slowly. The captain then turned on a small monitor. It showed video footage from a surveillance camera showing Ridwan praying and reading the Quran under the emergency stairs. "You're still doing it?" Nolan asked. "Even after I warned you, after I threw your book to the floor," Ridwan raised his head. "Because my faith is not dependent on place or circumstances. Faith cannot be silenced with threats, Captain." Nolan's eyes narrowed. He rose from his chair and approached Ridwan. "You know," he said quietly but sharply, "people like you who believe in an invisible God who lives by medieval rules, you are the ones who hinder civilization." Ridwan stared straight ahead. "We are not hinderers, Captain. We are guardians of conscience. The world may be sophisticated, but if it loses its values, it will crumble from within." Hearing that, Captain Nolan couldn't contain his anger. He swung his hand and slapped Ridwan. "Shut up! Don't preach in front of me!" Ridwan fell to the ground, his lips split, but he didn't retaliate. He simply picked up his fallen small Quran, dusted it off, and hugged him back. "Captain Nolan pointed to the exit before I actually throw you into the sea with your book." That night, the sea suddenly changed. Clouds rolled in quickly from the east. Lightning flashed incessantly. The wind blew wildly, rocking the large ship like a toy. The passengers began to feel restless. Some went out onto the deck to stare at the dark sky and the increasingly dense clouds. The waves began to rise. However, none of them realized that the storm at sea was merely a reflection of the storm of hatred in the hearts of men that was reaching its peak. In the hallway of the crew's bedroom, a young officer whispered to his colleague, "This is all strange. The sea has suddenly changed after those days of fighting." His colleague nodded. "I saw Ridwan beaten yesterday, and the captain is getting scarier." "This is karma," someone else muttered, "or something more." Ridwan sat in his cramped room, calming his beating heart. He heard the sound of the wind echoing outside. The vibrations from the deck made the glass of water on his small table vibrate. He opened his mushaf, contemporary prayer book, and read slowly, "Inal usra, indeed with hardship there is ease. Indeed with hardship there is ease." Quran, Surah Al-Inshirah, 67. His heart was calm. He knew the storm was not the end. Sometimes a storm is the beginning of great change. In the sky, thick clouds covered the stars. Lightning flashed not far from the ship. Captain Nolan stood in the control room, staring at the radar screen that was starting to error due to weather disturbances. And for the first time since the ship set sail, the false calm began to crumble. The night sky looked different. It was as if the universe was holding its breath. The wind wasn't strong yet, but it already felt bitter. The sky wasn't completely dark, but clouds were slowly covering the moon. It was as if nature knew something was happening, something that would be remembered forever by every soul aboard the Saffron Glory. While the passengers slept in their luxurious rooms, Ridwan sat alone on the ship's aft deck. The sea breeze caressed his tear-stained face. He sat cross-legged, clutching a small, worn but precious mushaf in his heart. Tonight, the longing for his mother was strong. Longing for his homeland, for the call to prayer from the small mosque in his village, for the warm embrace of his mother who always prayed for him before bed. In a soft voice barely audible over the wind, Ridwan prayed, "O Allah, I am far from home, from the people I ask for, but I am not far from you. Don't let my heart die in the middle of this ocean. If I have to lose everything, don't take away this light." The light from Mu's words. He opened the Quran, reciting Surah Yasin. Her tears broke out, but she continued to recite the verses in a trembling yet solemn voice. Ya Asin walilak ina minal mursalin. Her tears fell onto the pages of the mushaf. She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying because she felt the world she lived in was too far from God. This ship was magnificent and shiny, but empty of dhikr and prostration. She felt like aboard a ship that rejected God. She was guarding the only light that still burned. But that night, like an unstoppable storm, someone lurked in the shadows. Captain Frederick Nolan, who was inspecting the situation on the upper deck, caught Ridwan again, sitting, crying, and reading the Quran. The look in his eyes immediately changed. Resentment, anger, and disapproval boiled over. "You again!" he shouted loudly. Ridwan was shocked and quickly closed his Quran and stood up, but he didn't have time to hide it. Captain Nolan stepped forward quickly. His face was full of uncontrollable anger. "I've told you so many times. Stop it. Stop it. Captain, I'm not disturbing anyone. It's nighttime. Everyone's sleeping. I'm just reading." "Enough." Nolan snapped, then snatched the Quran from Ridwan's hands. Ridwan screamed softly, trying to hold back his anger, but Nolan's hand was stronger. With overflowing emotion, Nolan raised the Quran high. "You think this book will save you? It will save this ship. It will change everything. Captain, please don't." Ridwan's voice was trembling. His eyes were glassy, but Nolan didn't care. With one rough movement, he threw the Quran into the sea. "Look," he shouted hatefully. "The holy book, it can't fly. It can't save you. In the sea, it will sink, disappear, and be destroyed, just like your faith." The Quran floated briefly in the air, then fell to the surface of the sea, creating a small splash. The current carried the manuscript slowly away, floating, and then disappeared into the darkness of the night. Ridwan stood frozen as if his soul had been thrown along with the manuscript. He remained silent for a few seconds, then fell to his knees. His tears broke out not from fear, not from humiliation, but from the deep sorrow of seeing the word of his God insulted and discarded like trash. "Oh God," he whispered softly, his tears unstoppable. "Forgive him, for he knows not what he does." But less than a minute later, the sky thundered. Lightning flashed in the distance. The wind, which had been gentle, turned into a fury. Black clouds rolled in quickly from the west, covering the sky like a curtain of death. Captain Nolan was shocked. The wind knocked his cap overboard. He turned to stare at the darkness that had suddenly arrived like a giant monster. The officers on the bridge began screaming in panic. Radio communication was disrupted. The radar screen suddenly went dark. The compass spun erratically. A storm was coming, and it was no ordinary storm. A few minutes later, the entire ship was rocked violently. Sleeping passengers awoke with screams. The windows rattled violently. Guests ran around in their pajamas, screaming for life jackets. In the restaurant, the lights went out. In the karaoke room, the screens shattered. Drinks spilled everywhere. Several people toppled over as the ship tilted sharply to the left. The Saffron Glory, the pride of modern technology, was now like a toy boat trampled by giant waves. Amidst the chaos, Ridwan collapsed on the deck, his body battered by rain and wind. But he did not run away, nor did he blame anyone. He simply looked up to the sky and began to pray through tears. "Oh Allah, forgive us, forgive them. Do not let us drown in our arrogance." He began to recite the verses he still memorized. "And when my servants ask you about me, then indeed I am near." Quran Surah Al-Baqarah 186. Hasbunallahu al-Wakil. Allah is sufficient for us, and He is the best protector. Quran Surah Ali Imran 173. Her tears mixed with rain. Her lips trembled with cold and fear, but she remained firm. She knew Allah was listening. Captain Nolan, who had been so powerful, now collapsed on the deck. His hands trembled. All his tools had failed. All his navigational skills were powerless against waves as high as mountains. His arrogance crumbled in an instant, and amidst the roar of the storm, he saw something he could never forget. Ridwan was still praying, not running away, not screaming hysterically. Hanak, hands. For the first time in his life, Nolan felt fear. Not fear of the storm, but fear of something much greater. Something Ridwan had and he didn't. He fell to his knees, sobbing, "Oh God, if you exist, save us. Forgive me." And that night the storm raged. But it wasn't just the ship that was shaken. Some souls began to melt. Some hearts began to submit. The night sky seemed to lose its color. The pitch black gaped like a giant mouth ready to swallow everything. Raging winds battered the starboard side of the Saffron Glory with a force never before seen in the sailing world. Torrential rain fell not in drops, but like lashings of water from the sky. Within minutes, the luxury liner, once resplendent with festive lights, was transformed into a floating hell. The waves came like giant walls towering as high as a 5-story building. The first wave slammed into the ship's side, causing it to list sharply to the left. Passengers screamed hysterically. Plates flew from restaurant tables. Glasses shattered. Chairs were thrown against the windows. In the karaoke room, which hours before had been filled with laughter and dissonant singing, there were now only screams, cries, and the sound of people chanting the name of their God. An old woman screamed, her body slammed against the wall. A small child was thrown from her father's arms, crying incessantly. People scrambled for life jackets. Some crawled, trying to find a way out of the flooded corridor. "Help! Help! We're going to drown. This is a curse. This is karma." Amid the chaos, Captain Nolan struggled to rise from the control room floor. His hands trembled as he held the steering wheel, but the navigation system was paralyzed. The compass was not working. The radio only emitted an indistinct crackling sound. "This is impossible," he told himself. Sweat mixed with raindrops dripped from his forehead. This ship can withstand any storm. We've tested everything." But the reality was undeniable. Their technology was no match for the wrath of the heavens. On the rear deck, Ridwan remained in a prostrate position. His body was buffeted by the rain. His hair was soaked, but he didn't move. His hands remained raised. His face was wet with tears in the sky. Amidst the roar of the wind and waves, he continued to recite the prayer in a low but confident voice. "There is no power or strength except with the permission of Allah. O Allah, save us from your punishment." Then he recited the verses he still memorized. Or who is it that grants prayer? He who is in trouble when he prays to him, and who removes his distress. Quran, chapter An-Naml 62. Ridwan's lips continued to tremble in remembrance and supplication. He did not shout. He did not command. But his voice, his prayer, penetrated the darkness of the sky, overpowering the noise of the engines and the panicked cries of the people. Several crew members saw Ridwan continuing to pray in the midst of the storm. They were initially surprised, then fell silent. "Look at him," said one of the crew members. "He did not panic, he did not run." Another chimed in. "He was calm, as if he knew what he was doing." Among the crew and passengers, a small courage arose to approach. A restaurant waiter who often saw Ridwan reading the Quran quietly approached. He fell twice because the ship was rocking, but continued to move forward. Behind him, several passengers joined him. They crouched down beside Ridwan, not knowing what to say. Ridwan slowly opened his eyes and looked at those who were gathering. He said a prayer softly. "Now is not the time to argue, not the time to be angry. Pray because no one can save us tonight except Allah." Some of them immediately won. They were not Muslims. They did not know the prayers in Islam, but they bowed their heads, raising their hands, following the sound of Ridwan's continuous dhikr. Captain Nolan watched all this from a distance. His body was weak, water dripping from his face. He stumbled toward those sitting on the deck, soaking wet, but as if possessed of an inexplicable calm. In their midst, Ridwan sat quietly, his eyes closed, his lips trembling as he read Surah Al-Falaq. Captain Nolan stopped, his chest heaving with the memory of that night when he threw the Musaf into the sea, insulting the Quran and slapping the young man. He had challenged the power he had always considered imaginary, and now, when everything he had been proud of was destroyed by the storm, Ridwan remained intact. He slowly lowered his head, his knees weak. He wept. Tears that weren't just from fear of death, but from the realization that he had made a terrible mistake. "Oh God," he said, If you really exist, if you hear me, please forgive me." The steering wheel continued to spin aimlessly. The radar screen was pitch black, and the digital indicators only reflected chaotic numbers that had no meaning. On the main screen, the navigation map showed the ship spinning in place as if completely out of control. The main engines hummed loudly and then, one by one, mysteriously shut down as if they were running out of breath. Captain Freder Nolan stood on the bridge. His face was pale, his hands gripping the steering wheel, as if he could still force the ship to obey. But in vain, nothing was working. "This is impossible," he muttered in a hoarse voice that was barely audible. He tried to contact the engine room via the intercom. "Engine room report status." No answer. "Emergency control room." "Answer me, Suni." He pressed all the buttons nervously. Harder, faster, but still not a single system responded. The billion-dollar cruise ship was completely paralyzed. Suddenly, a loud noise was heard behind him. Several crew members broke into the bridge. Their faces were panicked, their clothes soaked, some bloody. One of the technicians shouted, "All systems down, Captain." Another echoed, his voice trembling. "The backup generators aren't starting. Even the manual systems aren't working at all." Captain Nolan took a deep breath. "Calm down, we can control the situation. We've been through storms bigger than this." But before he could finish his sentence, one of the more senior crew members, an older gray-haired man, usually the most obedient, stepped forward and glared at him. "No, Captain. This is no ordinary storm, and this is no ordinary situation." Nolan fell silent. "This is karma, Captain," another crew member shouted from behind. "This is punishment. You insulted the Quran. You threw God's word into the sea. Now look, even this magnificent ship of yours is bowing helplessly." Captain Nolan took a step back. His mouth opened but couldn't form a rebuttal. What could he say? All the tools, systems, technology, things that had been his pride and source of arrogance, were now useless. He stood in the middle of the control room like a child who had lost a toy. His eyes were glassy. Meanwhile, on the back deck, Ridwan still sat hugging his knees. He stared at the sea, which was starting to calm but not yet completely calm. He knew this wasn't over. Several passengers still sat around him. On their faces was a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and hope. No one expected that in the midst of this luxurious cruise ship without a prayer room, they would find the light of a young cleaner. Ridwan stood slowly and said softly but firmly, "We are still alive because Allah has not taken everything away, but our test is not over." "What test do you mean?" asked a female passenger, hugging her child. "A test of the heart. Who wants to return? Who remains arrogant?" Not long after, the deck door opened loudly. Captain Nolan appeared, his steps unsteady. His face was not like his usual. There was no longer any firmness, no more arrogance. His eyes were red, his hair was messy, and his shoulders seemed to slump as if carrying a heavy burden. He looked at Ridwan for the first time with eyes that no longer looked down on him. He stood before Ridwan and knelt. Everyone's eyes widened. No one had ever imagined that Captain Freder Nolan, the man who had once banished religion from every corner of the ship, would now kneel before a cleaner. In a choked voice, he said, "I can no longer control this ship. Everything is dead. Everything is damaged. I have insulted your God." He bowed his head deeper. His tears broke. "I need guidance. I need forgiveness." The atmosphere was silent. Only the sound of water still dripping from the edge of the ship and the sigh of the wind that was starting to subside could be heard. Ridwan approached. He bent down and gently touched the captain's shoulder. "Allah is forgiving. Captain, even to Pharaoh who claimed to be God, Allah gave a chance until the end. You still have time? Don't waste it." Captain Nolan nodded shakily. "Teach me how to ask for forgiveness." Ridwan closed his eyes for a moment. Then he guided the captain in the words that were the key to all forgiveness and all guidance. And that night on the helpless ship in the middle of the sea that witnessed the wrath and grace of converting to Islam, his tears were not shed from fear anymore, but from honest regret. He knew there was no going back to his old self. Now he was a new person. In the control room, the indicator lights suddenly lit up one by one. The radar system began to function again. The compass returned to pointing north. A voice from the engine room came over the intercom. The ship was stable again. "Captain," the people were silent. "This is impossible," the technician whispered, but Ridwan said with a gentle smile, "Nothing is impossible if it is God's will." This ship returned not because of technology, but because of hearts that finally prostrated themselves. And that day, everyone on board witnessed that greatness lies not in the luxury of the ship, but in the submission of the heart. It was late at night, but the storm that had raged just hours earlier had now given way to a gentle drizzle. A thin mist had begun to descend over the deck of the Saffron Glory, creating a strangely cool and calm air after all the chaos and fear the passengers had experienced. In the middle of the vast wet deck, Ridwan remained kneeling, wearing a soaked cleaning uniform. His fatigue and cold seemed to have been washed away by his strong faith. Under the dim light of the ship's lights, his face radiated a serenity rarely seen amidst the panic. Ridwan's hands were raised high to the sky. His face was bowed, and his moist eyes could not hide the sincerity of his prayer. Surah Al, verse 87. Ridwan's voice, soft yet hopeful, pierced the silent night. It was the prayer of the prophet Yunus when he was in the belly of the whale, a prayer of acknowledgement of God's power and an admission of one's own mistakes, a prayer that became a source of strength in the most difficult of times. "O Allah," whispered Ridwan, forgive us who are weak. Do not inflict punishment, but bestow mercy on yourself." Around the deck, several passengers began to awaken from their sleep. Still dressed in their wet and wrinkled party clothes, they glanced at each other, confused and uncertain, then glanced at Ridwan, who continued to pray. Among them, Captain Nolan stood with his head bowed, his wet jacket clinging to his body. His face looked tired and regretful. But there was something different. There was sincerity radiating from it. Nolan slowly walked toward Ridwan and the several crew members who were watching. His heart felt touched. Perhaps for the first time, he even felt the peace that comes from acknowledging God's greatness. Ridwan opened his eyes, glanced at Captain Nolan, then continued his prayer. "It is He who enables you to travel on land and at sea with all its blessings. So when they are on board and a favorable wind blows," Surah Yunus, verse 22. Ridwan recited the verse in a heart-rending voice, describing how God controls nature and life. In the midst of this vast ocean, humans are not true rulers, only small creatures dependent on His power. The listening passengers fell silent. Some of them were moved. Those who had previously been indifferent to religion, even dismissing it as nonsense, now felt a deep sense of conviction. A young woman who had only hours before dismissed Ridwan's prayer as a distraction was now in tears. A middle-aged man who had previously considered religion a burden was now raising his hand, trying to follow Ridwan. And Captain Nolan, who had previously cursed the Quran and belittled prayer, now stood with his head bowed, feeling that behind those words was an extraordinary power that could not be ignored. That night, Ridwan led a prayer that was not only an acknowledgement of human weakness, but also a plea for mercy and salvation. He invited all present, regardless of religion or background, to raise their hands and pray to the Almighty God. Let us together ask for salvation for us all. We are only weak human beings. We can only hope in Him. One by one, the different voices began to unite. There were prayers from various religions. There were simple requests coming from the lips of people who had never prayed before. The day grew brighter, the sky began to redden, seabirds began to sing, and the night air was replaced by the calming, fresh scent of the sea. On the deck, Ridwan and Captain Nolan sat side by side, gazing at the horizon. The storm had passed, but the lessons of that night remained etched in everyone's hearts. Captain Nolan broke the silence. His voice was deep and meaningful. "Ridwan, you have shown me a path I once arrogantly rejected. I want to learn. I want to change." Ridwan smiled softly. God always opens doors for anyone who is willing to come and acknowledge Him. "Captain, it's never too late." Captain Nolan's eyes filled with tears. "Help me, Ridwan. Guide me to understand the true meaning of faith." That same day, Ridwan led the dawn prayer on the ship's deck for the first time, joined by Captain Nolan and several other passengers whose hearts had been moved. One by one, the sound of the takbir, recitation of the Islamic call to prayer, floated through the clear morning air. It wasn't just words, but a soul-stirring prayer that connected hearts that had previously been separated. For the passengers and crew, it wasn't just a ritual of worship. It was the beginning of a new journey, a journey toward peace, recognition, and submission to the Creator. Before the sun had fully risen, Captain Nolan stood on the edge of the deck, gazing at the now calm and peaceful sea. He took a deep breath, feeling the sea breeze caress his face. "Oh God," he whispered softly, "thank you for this second revelation. Thank you for sending Ridwan as a light in the darkness of my life." Ridwan stood beside him, watching the horizon begin to brighten. He knew the journey was still long, but tonight they had taken the first step. The morning sun gently filtered through the thin fog on the deck of the Saffron Glory. The tension on the ship, which had been filled with tension the night before, was gradually calming. But in Captain Freighter Nolan's heart, the storm was just beginning to subside, a storm within himself. He sat in a corner of the deck. His usually arrogant face was now filled with silence and sorrow. Ridwan's soft voice reciting verses from the Quran that he had once belittled and despised now echoed in his ears, relentlessly. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 2. Each word sent a strange vibration through his chest. He felt something missing, something he had never wanted to seek: honesty with himself and with God Almighty. With trembling hands, he took a deep breath and lowered his head. Slowly, he knelt on the cold deck of the ship. For the first time in his life, a man who had been arrogant and hateful of religion now bowed down. In the silence of the morning, he began to pray in a hoarse, humble voice. "O Allah, if you exist, I ask for forgiveness. I was wrong. I was foolish. I was arrogant. I have denied you and insulted your word." Tears streamed down his cheeks. "Forgive me, save us, and guide me on your path." Meanwhile, Ridwan, who was cleaning his tools, accidentally glanced at the captain. He was stunned. The man who had once been filled with anger and insults now knelt helplessly and begged for forgiveness. Ridwan approached cautiously, afraid to disturb the moment, but also wanting to show support. "Captain, Allah is most gracious and most merciful," he said softly. "Anyone who returns to him sincerely will be accepted." Nolan lifted his head, looking at Ridwan with tear-filled eyes. "I want to learn, Ridwan. I want to understand." In the following days, small changes began to appear. Captain Nolan began to open up, no longer as arrogant as before. He asked Ridwan to help him study the Quran, even starting his day by reading several verses together. The sound of the holy verses was no longer a foreign sound, but a reminder that guided his every step. Among the verses read together, there was one that stuck the most to Nolan's heart. "Indeed, with difficulty there is ease. Indeed, with difficulty there is ease." Surah Al-Inshirah, verse 56. This verse gives him strength when facing shame, fear, and questions within himself. Not only did the captain's heart begin to melt, but also the crew and passengers who witnessed this change. They began to believe that the miracle that happened was not a coincidence. A female passenger said to her friend, "I never cared about religion before, but look, the captain who used to be stubborn has now changed completely. There is something bigger than just technology on this ship." One afternoon, as the sun was starting to set, Captain Nolan sat with Ridwan on the ship's deck. He admitted, "I feel like I was born again. The heavy burden of years was gone, but I'm also scared, afraid of the future, afraid to face the people I once insulted." Ridwan smiled. "Change is not easy, Captain. But God always makes a way for those who are sincere. Don't be afraid, keep praying and believing." That night, Nolan wrote a short letter to his family, apologizing for his mistakes and arrogance, and informing them of his new hopeful journey. He knew this was just the beginning of a total transformation, and he was ready to take it one step at a time. The next day, Nolan invited the crew and several passengers to gather in the main dining room. In a softer, more thoughtful voice, he spoke, "Friends, I apologize for my arrogance and disdain for your beliefs. I realize that power and technology are not everything. There is a greater power that I have rejected. I want to start a new chapter, not just for me, but for all of us." One by one, applause echoed in the room. A sense of relief and hope flowed among them. Meanwhile, Ridwan smiled happily, knowing that his prayers and patience had paid off. On that long voyage at sea, Captain Nolan learned that glory doesn't belong to the most intelligent or wealthy, but to those who are humble and open to the truth. After a tense night, when a fierce storm battered the Saffron Glory with raging waves as high as walls, morning dawned with unexpected peace. It was as if it truly answered the young man's sincere prayers, and even the captain's, whose heart was beginning to soften. The previously dark and gloomy sky turned bright blue, with warm sunlight piercing the thin mist over the open sea. The waves that had previously been raging and battering the ship's hull began to subside, allowing the majestic vessel to float steadily in the vast ocean. In the engine room, the anxious technicians were able to restart the ship's engines, which had stalled due to the storm. The engines hummed to life smoothly, and the previously dead navigation screens lit up again, displaying the nautical chart and the ship's stable position. "The engine's back on, Captain," one of the technicians exclaimed in a relieved voice. Captain Nolan stood in front of the control panel. His eyes were filled with emotion and gratitude. He took a deep breath, as if inhaling the new air of life God had given him. "Alhamdulillah, Allah is great," he said softly. Tears streamed down his cheeks. On the main deck, the atmosphere was different from the anxiety of the previous night. The passengers, who had been screaming in fear and clinging to each other last night, now looked up at the sky with uncontrollable emotion and gratitude. A young woman sobbed as she looked up at the blue sky and said softly, "It's a miracle we were saved." Several people immediately prostrated themselves on the deck in gratitude. Their hands were raised to the sky, their eyes closed in prayer. Ridwan stood in the middle of the crowd, smiling a small but meaningful smile. He looked at the captain, who now looked different, more humble, more peaceful. Captain Nolan stepped forward, his voice echoing quietly among the crowd. "I want to thank you all for your patience during yesterday's storm. I also want to admit that I have made many mistakes. I have overlooked a power greater than technology and human reason." He raised his hand, inviting everyone to unite in prayer and gratitude. "We were saved not only by the powerful machine and crew, but by the grace of Almighty God. Let us pray together for safety and blessings for us all." The sound of prayer and takbir echoed across the ship's deck. Some passengers who had previously hesitated now raised their hands and prayed fervently. Some cried, others smiled with relief. An elderly man with a hoarse but confident voice led the prayer. "O Allah, you are the most gracious and merciful. Thank you for your protection in the midst of the storm that threatened our lives. Forgive our sins and guide us toward goodness." In that moment, the bond between passengers and crew felt stronger. Differences in religion, status, and background seemed to disappear in the warmth of sincere shared prayer. Captain Nolan looked at Ridwan with respect. "Thank you, Ridwan. Without your prayers and faith, I don't know how I would have survived." Ridwan simply smiled. "All this is thanks to God's grace, Captain. We are only weak servants, but we have hope. We surrender." That afternoon, the atmosphere on the ship changed to a more cheerful one. The passengers began to enjoy the ship's facilities with deep gratitude. The bar, restaurant, and amusement park, which had originally been merely entertainment venues, now felt more meaningful. Ridwan saw passengers starting to ask questions about religion and the Quran. Some even wanted to learn more. He patiently answered their questions and encouraged them to open their hearts. Captain Nolan held a meeting with the crew. He spoke in a firm but gentle voice. "We're going to make major changes on this ship. From now on, I will ensure there is a proper place of worship for anyone who wants to pray, especially for those of you who have had difficulty finding a place to pray." The entire crew welcomed with warm applause. That night, Ridwan and Captain Nolan stood on the ship's deck, gazing at the star-studded sky. "Miracles aren't just about the weather, Captain," Ridwan said quietly. "The greatest miracle is when our hearts are open and we acknowledge God's power." Nolan had budgeted a lot. "I want my life to be meaningful not only to myself, but also to others and to God." The Glory, once a symbol of arrogance and rejection, had now transformed into a ship full of blessings and new hope. It carried the message that true power lies not in technology or human arrogance, but in humility and sincere faith. That night, the deck of the Saffron Glory was filled with solemn silence. The stars sparkled brightly in the cloudless sky. It was as if they were witnessing a moment that would change the lives of many on the luxury ship. The ship's lights dimmed, and one by one, the passengers and crew gathered on the main deck. They heard news of the profound change that had occurred in Captain Frederick Nolan, a figure who had always been known for his arrogance and stubbornness. Ridwan stood beside the captain. His face was filled with emotion, and his eyes radiated a joy that was difficult to express in words. He knew that tonight was the culmination of a spiritual journey that had lasted for days. Captain Nolan looked around him. Eyes that had once been full of arrogance were now wet with tears of regret and hope. His voice, which had been harsh and full of reproach, now trembled with deep sincerity. "Friends, companions, and everyone here," he said slowly. His voice echoed in the night air. "I stand before you not as an arrogant and hateful captain, but as a human being who wants to change and acknowledge the truth I have always denied." He turned to Ridwan, who gestured for him to continue. With a steady voice, Captain Nolan uttered a sentence he had never imagined would come out of his mouth. "There is no God but Allah, and there is no prophet of Allah." After a night of confession and miracles, the Saffron Glory slowly transformed into a different place,